Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting lecture of cognitive psychology. Today, we are going to be talking about problem solving and the different aspects associated with problems that we encounter, and also different types of solutions that we sometimes encounter throughout the process of problem solving. So, when we think of this aspect of problem solving, the major issue here that we have to consider is always what is the problem that we are wanting to focus in on, or what is the problem that is of interest to us. Now, whenever it is that we use this term problem, do understand here that we're not necessarily saying that this has to be something that is wrong or that there is an issue that always needs remedying, but yet you view it as being a potential opportunity for you to remedy a situation. And again, here it may even be something as simple as, how do I get to the grocery store, or what am I going to have for dinner tonight? That may potentially be a problem that you may be encountering. So when we think of problems, do understand here that we're not always talking about it being something bad that's hindering your ability to accomplish something, but yet rather we're just saying here that they are different types of questions or issues that may potentially arise in specific situations. So when we think of problems and when we think of what we're trying to do with a specific problem, imagine that there's essentially two states here that we have. The first state is going to be your goal state. And when we talk about your goal state, this is essentially the desired outcome that we hope to achieve versus the current state. And the current state is the current situation that you are in at present time. So when we think of a problem, let that be any problem that we may consider, that we may encounter, we always have to view it as having both of these potential conditions or both of these factors. Number one being, where am I currently at? And number two, where is it that I want to be at? So what's the solution that I want to have in terms of the outcome associated with the specific problem? So the problem really exists when the goal state and the current state are different. So in other words, your current state is not the goal state, right? So in other words, you have not achieved the specific issues that you would like to achieve associated with that issue, and that's why we're now going to consider this to be a problem, because there's this deviation between your goal state and your current state. So the issue of problem solving, because again, that's what we're essentially trying to do. We're trying to solve this potential problem that we have, or this potential issue, essentially occurs when the goal state is transformed into the goal state. So in other words, you've achieved your goal. And that's really what the idea of problem solving is in terms of cognition. That what we're going from is we're saying, okay, this is where I'm currently at present time. Now I want to be at the goal state. How do I actually get at the goal state? And the process by which that occurs is going to be this aspect of problem solving. In other words, you achieving your goal. So we really want to begin with the goal state and seek different types of steps that are ultimately going to lead us down to the path to our goal. Now, do realize that there may be many different paths, but yet some paths may be better, yet some paths may be worse in terms of time, in terms of efficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yet what we want to do is we want to get to the goal state no matter what. That's ultimately the point of the aspect of problem solving. So in other words, you want to go to the store, but how do you get to the store without a car? Well, there's different ways that you can potentially do that. You could call a family member to come and pick you up, or you can go and steal a car. You could take the bus, you could take a helicopter, you could take a plane. These are all relatively realistic options, but yet in terms of their efficiency, in terms of their practicality, none of them may actually work, or some of them may potentially work, or some of them may be more effective or more realistic versus others. So for instance, you calling somebody to come and pick you up and take you to the grocery store may be a more realistic way to solve that problem versus you stealing a car or taking a helicopter to the grocery store. So when we're thinking of this aspect of problem solving, we realize that there is that huge disconnect between our current state and our goal state, and that creates for us a problem, right? That's essentially what we're trying to get at this point. So we have to come up with this ability to be able to solve that potential problem, and using different solutions or different creative methods to try to solve that problem is ultimately going to get us to our goal state. Now, you also have to realize that, let's say, for instance, you use a specific technique or a specific strategy to solve the problem, but yet you were not able to achieve your goal. Yes, you may have failed at solving the problem, but yet you have the ability to go back and reassess and now implement a new technique or a new solution to try to solve that potential problem. Or at least we hope that we do, all right? Let's say during an emergency situation or during a life-threatening situation, we may not have that flexibility, but yet in most situations that we encounter problems, there is going to be some room for us to be able to use different techniques or implement different strategies to try to solve the potential problems that we may encounter. So one key issue that we have to consider whenever it is that we're looking at this aspect of solving problems is the way that we actually represent the problem. Now, to use this idea of representation of a problem, we have to look back on our previous experiences or our previous knowledge to really understand what the problem is that we are encountering. So in other words, whenever it is that we encounter a situation that differs from our current state to our goal state, we normally look back on our previous experiences, in other words, our previous memory, and look based upon those experiences to try to understand what that problem is and also how to solve that particular problem. So in other words, you might be able to, in some particular cases, have already had the experience of solving a problem that is very similar to the current problem that you're in, and thus you can apply that specific solution to now this specific problem. Now, this is not always going to be the case, but yet in some situations that may actually occur. So when we think of this aspect of representation of a problem, we really are trying to understand the problem itself. And what is it about the problem is it that we're trying to understand? We're trying to understand the facts about it, the specifics, the goals, and also potential methods that we can use that are viable for us to solve this potential problem. Because part of the aspect of the representation, of understanding the problem in itself, is understanding what is physically possible or what is realistically possible for us to be able to use a solution to the problem. And also, what is the point of us solving the problem? So what is the goal? So once it is that I solve this potential problem, what is it that I will be able to attain? Or what is it that I will be able to achieve? And again, most of the time, based on our previous experiences, we're going to be able to solve potential problems that are somewhat similar to each other. Now, take the case, for instance, with children, that children in many instances have never really had specific types of problems that they've encountered throughout their lives. So, for instance, they've never really had the issue of trying to buy something when they don't have money, but yet they don't understand why they cannot purchase that potential product if they don't have money, because they've never had that experience before. So now here, you have to be able to teach them how to solve that potential problem, all right? So you don't have money to buy this piece of candy, but you want to buy the piece of candy and you need money. So let's do this potential task so that way you can get money and then you can use that money to buy the candy. Now in the future, whenever it is that they want to encounter a certain problem that is very specific or very similar to the one that we've just talked about now, again wanting to buy a piece of candy or even buying a toy, they may then look in their previous memory and say, well, in the past I've done these kinds of actions and that's gotten me money, so if I do that, I'll now receive money and I can use the money to now buy this potential toy. So even though the problem may be a little bit different, they can still rely on their previous experiences to help them solve that potential problem. Now, whenever it is that we're really applying our previous knowledge or previous techniques to the solution of problems, we're really looking at what we call a routine problem solving procedure. Now, with routine problem solving procedures, we essentially are trying to solve problems that have already occurred in our past or that are very similar to our past. This makes it the aspect of being routine. So in other words, we encounter them pretty frequently. So if we've encountered them pretty frequently or we've encountered similar situations as we have in the past, thus now I'm going to be able to apply very similar solutions to the new problems or to the same problem over and over again, so that way I can solve that potential issue. So solving routine problems tends to go smoothly and also very quickly. And why is it that we will go smoothly and quickly? Because now you're getting used to actually doing the procedure. So think of it like from what we've talked about in our previous lectures, that we've talked about controlled versus automatic processes. And remember that with controlled processes, you really have to apply a lot of cognitive attention resources to the actual solution of the problem, or that you actually have to pay a lot of attention to completing the task. Once it is that you're engaged in the task enough times, it becomes more of an automatic procedure that you don't even have to pay so much attention anymore to try to solve that problem or actually engage in the task and complete it correctly. So here, same thing is happening. The more times that you engage in the exact same problem over and over and over again, the easier it's going to be to actually solve that problem. Think of it, for instance, as when your internet's not working anymore. One of the quickest solutions that we have to your internet not working is, well, unplug the router and plug it back in, right? Wait a couple of seconds and then plug it back in, and hopefully that will make it work. And most of the time that actually happens, right? That you unplug it, you plug it back in, and your internet's back up and running. In the future, your internet's not working, you're probably going to resort to that specific solution. And here, most of the time, it's going to go faster and faster and faster that you're going to be able to actually engage in that specific behavior to solve that problem. Why? Because that behavior or that solution has actually solved the problem in the past. But let's say, for instance, you encounter the problem that the internet's not working. You go and you unplug the router, you plug it back in, but it does not work now. So it's still, the internet still does not come back on. Now what do? Well, now here you have to think of a non-routine problem-solving solution so that way we can now get the internet to come back on. Because your routine problem-solving behavior did not actually allow you to reach your goal, which was to get the internet working again. So here we have to always make sure that we understand with this aspect of routine problem solving solutions that even though we engage in that behavior and that we've engaged in it in the past and it's worked, it's not always guaranteed that it's actually going to help you with your current problem, even though it may be a same problem or even a similar problem that we may be encountering. So we always have to understand that there may be some deviations in terms of the goal or in terms of the method that we actually use to solve that potential problem. So when we think of general problem-solving methods or solutions, how is it that we actually get to this point where we say we are going to solve the problem? And in reality, the way that we think of this idea is that problem-solving can be thought of as a search. So it's actually as if you were navigating yourself through a maze. So you're actually going through this maze, getting from point A to point B. And there's lots of different routes that we can actually take between point A and point B, but yet some of them may be more effective than others. So when we think of this aspect of a maze, when we begin at point A is going to be our initial state. The current state of knowledge that you have, the current state of resources that you have at the outset of the task itself or of trying to solve that problem. So in other words, when we think of the initial state, we have to think about where we're currently at and everything that we have, all our skill set that we have associated with our initial state or with our current state. We also then have to think of point B, which is going to be our goal state, right? So the state that we're working towards. So point A is the initial state, point B is going to be the goal state. And then we also have in between what we call operators. And operators are going to be the tools, we're going to have actions that we're going to take that are going to allow us to be able to approximate our goal state. So in other words, how are we going to reach our goal state? Well, we need some resources, we need some tools. And sometimes we're going to have to get some more tools or some more skills or some more resources during point A to point B so that way we can reach point B. Okay, because sometimes we may not have the resources or we may not have the skills and we may have to acquire some additional operators to actually reach our goal state. And then we also have what are called path constraints. And with path constraints here, we have limits that rule out some potential operators. So let's say, for instance, that you want to buy a house. And one of the ways that you can buy a house is by having money. How do you get money? Well, one of the ways that we can get money is by working very hard day after day, year after year, and saving up enough money so that way we can actually purchase a home, right? And that may be an operator, right? So in other words, I don't have the resources. So at my initial state, I don't have the resources in terms of money, but the operators, in other words, some actions or some tools that I can use along this road from point A to point B is to work harder every single day, day after day, year after year, so that way I can get money and save some money to buy a house. But yet, there are going to be some path constraints. And what are going to be some of those path constraints? Well, some of those path constraints are going to be that, you may want a job that pays $1 million in a year. And that's great, right? I mean, those jobs do exist out there. But yet, you may not be able to get that job. Why? Because you may not have the specific resources or even the specific operator at that time to be able to acquire that potential job of $1 million. Or you could potentially go and rob a bank. Well, if you go and rob a bank, well, that is a potential option that you may have, but yet you may actually rule that out as an operator. Why? Because it may not be a feasible option for you. So you can still go and you can rob a bank and you can get $1 million very quickly or even enough money to buy a house. But yet, are you going to be able to do that realistically? So here we have to assume that there are going to be some avenues that we just cannot take, that they may be options, but we cannot take them for whatever the reason may be. Let that be moral reasons, logistic reasons, monetary reasons, whatever the case may be, but yet we are just not able to use some of those specific paths. Now, in contrast to using routine problem-solving solutions, we encounter the aspect of non-routine problem-solving solutions. And with non-routine problem-solving solutions, we stress the use of procedures or strategies that do not guarantee a solution to a problem, but offer the possibility of a success. So in other words, we've encountered similar situations in the past, but yet using those problem-solving solutions may potentially actually get me to my goal state, but it may not. And why? Because this specific problem that I have may be a little bit different than the previous problems I've encountered in my past. So what we want is ultimately, again, to get to our goal state, but in some specific instances, we may not be able to approximate our goal state because we may encounter this specific issue of not having a guarantee with the solution method that we're going to be implementing. Now, when we consider, for instance, generational differences or differences in terms of age, we see that for an adult, we can have something be what we call a routine problem or have a routine problem solution, but for a child, it may become a non-routine problem solution. And take into consideration, for instance, again, that we base ourselves off of our experience, that we're learning information as we grow older. So as we're growing older and we're gaining more experience and having all these different problems that we've encountered and applying different solution methods to it, we're going to be able to implement them later on and take a non-routine problem-solving solution and convert it to being a routine problem-solving solution. Take, for instance, the case of a child when the internet's not working on their iPad, right? And this happens pretty frequently, right? So kids now are on their iPads pretty frequently. My daughter, for instance, loves her iPad. And one of the things that we find is that sometimes she turns on her iPad and it doesn't have any internet. So she freaks out, and her solution is to essentially throw the iPad and hopefully that will make it work, or just press buttons like crazy or press the screen and hopefully the internet will come back on. But for her, she doesn't have that ability to be able to solve the problem. But yet for me, I can grab her iPad, I can click on the settings, I can click on the Wi-Fi and click on the Wi-Fi that pertains to our home, and it's going to be able to access it, and now she has Wi-Fi. But for her, now her ability to not have Wi-Fi on her iPad has now encountered a solution. And her solution is, well, if I need Wi-Fi on it and I can't figure out how to do it, I know who can. So now rather than my daughter trying to mess around with the iPad and trying to figure out to see what happens, now all she does is if the internet doesn't work, she just yells at me and she just screams, "Dad!" And then I come running and she says, "iPad," and I turn on the iPad and I see what the problem is and I get it going for her. And there, she's encountered a solution. And now she's at her goal state where she's enjoying watching videos on YouTube or whatever the case may be. So here we have to understand that they're going to children are going to view things very differently than the way that we're going to view things, and they're going to implement different strategies in the way that we are going to implement strategies. And that's why with children, for instance, we see them throw temper tantrums because that's one way for them to solve the solution or to solve the problem. That's their solution in this particular case. For an adult, if an adult throws a temper tantrum, that's not an appropriate type of solution, and it's not going to actually get you to your goal state in that particular instance. So when we think about these differences between individuals and also between routine and non-routine problem-solving solutions, it really all depends on what the solver knows, because it's going to heavily depend on their previous experiences and what it is that they know in terms of their skill levels and in terms of their resource level as well. So it's great for us to think about how to solve problems, but then one of the key concerns that we have is what kinds of problems can we actually encounter during different situations. Now, there are two types of problems that we're going to be able to encounter during our daily lives or our daily routines. And the first one is what we call a well-defined problem. Now, with a well-defined problem, we have very specific properties or characteristics that we can identify with well-defined problems that ultimately they have very clearly described goals. They have all relevant information is specified to the individual who's trying to solve the problem. And last, they have a very clear ending. So in other words, we know exactly when the problem has been solved. So with a well-defined problem, you have to consider this. You have to be able to say to yourself, number one, do I know what the goal is or what the outcome is associated with this problem? Number two, do I have all the relevant information? So do I have all the specifics associated with this specific problem? So do I know all the ins and outs associated with this potential problem? And last, do I have a clear ending? So once I solve this problem, do I now know that the problem has been solved and I'm not going to encounter it again, at least for a specific period of time? So in other words, you know that you have the right solution and that solution has solved that problem. Now, this is a very difficult issue to be able to attain because when we think of well-defined problems and when we think of problems just in general, how many problems can you really say to yourself are really well-defined problems? And the answer is very, very unlikely. And the reason that well-defined problems are so unlikely is because sometimes they lack some of this information. Sometimes they lack what the goal is. Sometimes they lack specific information that you need to be able to achieve your goal. And last, sometimes you don't even know if the problem has actually been solved. It may just look like if the problem has been solved for now, and yet hopefully the problem does not reoccur in the future or even explode in some particular instances, right? And I'll give you an example of this in just a bit. So when we think of well-defined problems, it's very difficult to actually solve them because we have to decide how we're going to approach the problem. We're going to have to decide also what method to use to solve the problem, and also what's the best way for us to actually reach our goal. And this is going to be a very, very difficult task because even though it sounds very easy for us to say to ourselves, all right, we're just going to go ahead and implement the solution. We know when the problem is going to be solved and we can identify that the problem has ended. That may not always be the case. And we find that it's very, very difficult to solve these types of problems because in most cases, we don't even have all the relevant information. We may just apply a patch to the problem and it looks now that the situation has actually been fixed. I'll give you an example of this that I was actually just the other day. I was watching a Thomas the Train episode with my daughter, and in one of the Thomas the Train episodes, one of the trains is digging, or one of the equipments that they have, right? One of the machines that they had was digging next to a hill, and when they were digging, the machine accidentally hit one of the water pipes that was there, right? One of the water mains that was there. And water started gushing out. And Thomas says to the other machine, hey, we have to fix the problem. And essentially the other machine just said, oh yeah, no, not a problem at all. And just dumped dirt on top of the water main. And it pretty much just stopped the water for just a little bit, right? But you could see that the dirt was now starting to get a little bit wet in that specific scene. And everybody went home fine, and the machine said, it's not a problem at all. I can't remember the machine's name, that's why I'm not telling you what the machine's name is. I just remember Thomas. But essentially the machine was like, no, you see, we're all set, we're all good to go. The water stopped coming out, let's go. And they took off. Well, a day or two later, what do they find? They find that now there's this huge flood that's existing next to that hill, and it's creating a landslide on that hill because the water is now eroding all of that dirt. So now the problem is there again, and now the problem has actually gotten worse. So here in this specific case, for them, was this really a well-defined problem? Well, the answer is no, because for them, they did not really have all the relevant information as to what was actually happening in that specific case, and there really wasn't a very clear goal in terms of where it is that they needed to be. Now, granted, the goal should have been the water should stop coming out, but if they don't have the right solution for it, it's going to be very difficult to actually be able to correct that specific problem in that specific instance. So when we look at these key characteristics associated with these different types of problems, it is characteristic of this type of problem to have unambiguous goals. So in other words, we know exactly how many pieces to the puzzle they may be. We know exactly what path is the shortest, who committed the specific crime. We know that there's an unambiguous goal at the end. And that's ultimately what we want to get to. The information that's necessary for us to have a solution is given in the problem statement as well. So in other words, you need to be able to put this puzzle together in 10 moves. Perfect. Now you have specific information that's going to lead you to being able to achieve your goal. Because if you don't use it within 10, or if you don't solve it within 10 steps, you're not going to reach your goal. And fine, you're going to fail at that problem. And the final characteristic of well-defined problems is also that there has to be that stop rule. So in other words, there's a very clear ending. And here that ending should essentially say, you have completed the task or you have solved the problem and you are now good to go. Now, even though we say that we do have these well-defined problems and they may potentially exist, the majority of problems that actually come out are actually what we call ill-defined problems. Now, what is an ill-defined problem? An ill-defined problems are often more challenging and much more interesting than well-defined problems. And the reason that they're more challenging and more interesting, as you can assume, is because there's not always a clear question as to what it is that's really going on, what the goal is, or what potential solutions may actually occur or that can be used, or even if the solution is capable of ending the problem in this specific case. So in other words, it creates its own sets of challenges and it becomes a lot more interesting cognitively to us because there may be so many different routes or alternatives that may potentially allow you to solve that problem. But even when you solve the problem, you may not necessarily be sure that the problem has actually been solved in that particular case. Now, you have experienced these types of problems many, many times in your lives, and you've experienced them actually quite a bit in open-ended questions where there is no specific fixed answer in terms of an exam. So for instance, this semester during our exams that we've had long answer questions, here they're open-ended questions. So pretty much anything that you write may potentially lead you to answering that question correctly, but there may be times where some of the information that you write may not lead you to the right answer. So here, using open-ended questions actually become an ill-defined problem and allow you to use creative techniques or methods to be able to solve the problem. They are what we call open domain topics because you're ultimately free to consider any kind of information that you want and what it is that you think may be relevant to being able to solve that problem in that particular case. Now, when we look at some potential types of ill-defined problems, here are just some examples of that. What career should I pursue? How can I be happy? Is this person the love of my life? Is honesty the right action if it hurts someone's feelings? All of these are examples of ill-defined problems because number one, we don't necessarily know what the goal state is. Number two, I don't have all the relevant information associated with this specific problem. And then number three, whatever action it is that I do take in terms of implementing my solution may not necessarily lead me to being able to say that the problem has been solved. And that makes it very, very difficult for us to being able to adequately implement the right strategy. So in summary, when we think of this aspect of problem-solving behavior, we have to first think about what the goal of the problem is. So in other words, once I solve this problem, what's the purpose of me having actually solved that problem? Is it to make the problem go away? Is it for me to have happiness? Whatever the case may be. But ultimately, depending on what it is that we identify as being the goal, that's going to create different solutions or different paths for us to being able to solve that problem. And that's going to depend heavily on us and our previous experiences. So in other words, identifying the characteristics of the problems, number one, making sure if it's an ill-defined or a well-defined problem, identifying all the constraints, all those path constraints, all those operators, your initial state versus the goal state, and making sure that you use your previous experiences to being able to solve that problem are going to lead you down the path of potentially being able to solve the problem. Now here, if you noticed, I continue to say may potentially allow you to solve the problem because again, there's no guarantee that these problems will actually be solved. That wraps up our discussion associated with problem-solving behavior. Please let me know if you have any questions and I'll be happy to answer those.